My father called me on a Sunday afternoon and told me, without so much as a hello first, that he'd sold my childhood home to my brother for $1. Hello, friends. Don't forget to subscribe and drop a hi in the comments and tell us your city or country too. Let's get into the story. I sold the Maple Street house to Terrence, my father said, his voice flat, almost bored, like he was telling me the weather had turned. Figured you should hear it from me before the paperwork finalizes next week. I stood in my kitchen, holding a bag of groceries I never finished putting away. You sold it, I repeated. Dad, that house was Mom's. It was community property, he said. Mine to do with as I see fit. Terrence needs a place to raise his kids. You've got your own life out there in Portland. It made sense. What my father did not know, standing in his own kitchen 3 states away, congratulating himself on a decision he believed nobody could question, was that the house on Maple Street had never once, in the 11 years since my mother's death, actually belonged to him. And in exactly 9 days, I was going to walk back into that house holding a document that would make everything he thought he'd just accomplished completely, legally meaningless. If you've ever had a parent try to erase everything someone else left behind for you, stay with me. This one gets worse before it gets better. My name is Renee Ashworth, and I need to take you back to the beginning, because none of what happened that Sunday makes sense without it. My mother, Dolores Ashworth, died of ovarian cancer when I was 26, a slow, brutal 18-month decline that hollowed out our entire family in ways none of us fully recovered from. She was the person who held everything together, the one who remembered birthdays and smoothed over arguments and somehow made a modest teacher's salary stretch far enough to keep our house on Maple Street warm and full and stable for over 30 years. My father, Gerald Ashworth, worked as a regional sales manager for a plumbing supply company, and he loved my mother in his own way. But he had never once, in my entire childhood, been the parent either of us actually ran to when something went wrong. That role belonged entirely to my mother, and it belonged specifically to my older brother Terrence in a way it never quite belonged to me. Terrence was 4 years older than me, charming in the effortless way certain people just are, and utterly, chronically unable to hold on to anything good that came his way. While I worked 2 part-time jobs through college to avoid drowning in loans, Terrence dropped out of his second attempt at a business degree and moved back into the Maple Street house at 24, promising, always promising, that this next venture would finally be the one that stuck. My mother saw exactly what he was. She loved him fiercely anyway, the particular fierce love of a mother who understands her child's weaknesses better than he understands them himself. But she never once pretended his choices were good choices. My father did. My father wore blinders where Terrence was concerned that he never once extended to me. Your brother's finding his footing, my father used to say, whenever another job fell through or another relationship collapsed under the weight of Terrence's unreliability. He'll figure it out. I never got that same patience. When I struggled, the message was always some version of figure it out yourself. You're smart, you'll manage. I did manage. I built a stable career as a physical therapist, moved to Portland, built a life I was proud of. But I carried quietly for years the specific ache of watching my parents extend endless grace to my brother while expecting me to require none at all. My mother knew that ache. She saw it clearly, in ways I don't think my father ever fully did. In the final months of her illness, when it was just the 2 of us most afternoons while my father worked and Terrence drifted between his latest failed ventures, she talked to me honestly about the house. This place should be yours eventually, she told me one afternoon, propped up on pillows in the room that used to be my childhood bedroom before it became her sick room. Not split with your brother, not left to your father to decide however he wants. Yours. You're the one who'll actually take care of it. You're the one who won't sell it out from under a promise the moment things get difficult. I told her I didn't want to think about that, not while she was still there in front of me. She just smiled, tired but certain, and told me she'd already handled it. I didn't fully understand what she meant by that until nearly a decade later. What my mother had actually done, in the final 6 months of her life, working quietly with an estate attorney named Priscilla, who, without telling my father or Terrence a single word about it, was establish an irrevocable trust holding sole title to the Maple Street property, naming me as the sole beneficiary, with the specific, explicit condition that the trust wouldn't take effect and reveal itself until either my 35th birthday or my father's remarriage or death, whichever came first. Structured deliberately, Priscilla later explained to me, so my father could continue living in the home comfortably for as long as he needed to without ever losing his own housing security while he grieved and adjusted. My mother had recorded the trust deed properly at the county recorder's office. She had paid the modest annual fees to maintain it herself for years, quietly from a small personal savings account my father never knew existed. She had structured the entire arrangement, Priscilla told me later, specifically because she knew, with the particular clarity terminally ill people sometimes develop about the people they're leaving behind, that my father would eventually try to hand that house to Terrence the moment he felt entitled to make that decision alone. She had been right. She had simply made sure that, by the time he tried, the decision would never have actually been his to make. I didn't know any of this the Sunday my father called to tell me he'd sold the house for $1. I only knew, standing in my kitchen with a bag of groceries slowly warming on the counter, that something about the casual cruelty in his voice, the complete absence of any acknowledgement that this had been my mother's home too, that I had grown up there, that erasing me from it with a single phone call felt like exactly the kind of thing he'd normalized doing to me my entire life, cracked something open in my chest that had been quietly closing for years. "You should be happy for your brother," my father said, when I didn't respond right away. "He's finally settling down, getting his life together. This gives him a real foundation." And what foundation was I supposed to get? I asked quietly. "You don't need one," he said, like it was obvious. "You've always landed on your feet. Terrence needs this. You'll be fine." I hung up without saying much else. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that call, staring at nothing, feeling the particular hollow ache of being told, once again, that my competence was somehow a reason to expect less rather than a reason to be trusted with more. Then I called Priscilla, who I hadn't spoken to her in years, not since the brief, businesslike conversation right after my mother's funeral when she'd handled the modest estate paperwork everyone assumed was the entirety of what my mother left behind. A small life insurance policy split evenly between me and Terrence, some personal belongings, nothing that had ever seemed significant enough to remember the attorney's name for a decade. She answered on the second ring, and when I explained why I was calling, there was a long pause on her end. "Renee," she said finally, her voice carrying something careful and deliberate, "I need you to come into my office. There's something your mother arranged that I was instructed not to discuss with you until certain conditions were met." My stomach tightened. "What conditions?" "Your 35th birthday," she said, which, according to my file, was 4 months ago. I'd actually been planning to reach out to you soon regardless. This just accelerates things somewhat. I drove to her office the following morning, the same modest, book-lined space I barely remembered from 11 years earlier. Priscilla pulled a thick folder from a locked filing cabinet, the kind of careful, deliberate movement of someone who had been waiting a long time to finally open it. "Your mother came to me 6 months before she passed," Priscilla explained, sliding a document across the desk toward me. She was very clear about what she wanted and very specific about why. She established an irrevocable trust holding sole title to the Maple Street property. You are the sole named beneficiary. The trust document was recorded at the county recorder's office shortly after it was established. I stared at the document, my mother's careful signature at the bottom, dated just over 11 years earlier. This means the house was never actually his to sell. Legally, Priscilla said, your father has never held title to that property, not for the entire 11 years he's continued living in it. He held what's called a life estate, a legal right to occupy and use the property during his lifetime, granted informally by your mother's wishes and never contested because nobody outside this office knew the underlying trust existed. But a life estate holder cannot sell, transfer, or convey ownership of a property they don't actually hold title to. Any sale he's attempted to execute is void from the moment it's filed, regardless of what paperwork he's drawn up with your brother. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift inside my chest that I didn't fully have words for yet, grief and vindication and a strange, aching tenderness for a mother who had spent the final months of her life quietly, patiently protecting a version of my future she wouldn't be alive to witness. Why didn't she tell me? I asked. She was very deliberate about that, Priscilla said gently. She didn't want you carrying the weight of this secret for over a decade. Didn't want you resenting your father or your brother prematurely. Didn't want the house hanging over every family interaction like an unresolved argument. She wanted you to live your life fully first, and she trusted that if this situation ever came to a head, you'd have exactly what you needed, at exactly the moment you needed it. I thought about the timing then, the specific coincidence of my father's phone call arriving just 4 months after my 35th birthday had already quietly activated the trust's conditions. My mother had understood my father better than either of us probably wanted to admit. She'd known, with real precision, exactly how long his patience would last before he tried to hand Terrence something that was never fully his to give. I need everything, I told Priscilla. The full trust documentation, the recorded title history, everything that proves this clearly and completely. I already have it prepared, she said, sliding the thick folder fully across the desk. I've been waiting 11 years to hand this to you. I did not confront my father immediately. Some part of me understood, sitting in Priscilla's office with that folder in my lap, that the way I handled the next several weeks would matter considerably more than the satisfaction of an immediate, angry phone call. I spent the following week reviewing every document carefully, understanding the trust's full structure, confirming with Priscilla exactly what legal steps needed to happen to formally activate my ownership, and, if necessary, void whatever sale paperwork my father had already begun drawing up with Terrence. I learned that the transfer to Terrence hadn't yet been recorded at the county level, still sitting in draft form with a real estate attorney Terrence had hired, a detail that gave us a genuine window to intervene cleanly before anything became legally messier than it needed to be. I also, during that week, learned something else, almost by accident, that reshaped how I understood the entire situation. Terrence called me midweek, his voice carrying an odd, nervous energy I didn't immediately recognize. Dad mentioned he told you about the house, he said. I just want you to know, I wasn't trying to go behind your back or anything. He came to me with it. Why does he want to give it to you, specifically? I asked, genuinely curious now, watching for whatever answer he'd give. There was a pause. I'm kind of in a rough spot, he admitted finally. Behind on rent, where I'm at now. Dad thought this would help me get stable before things got worse. I felt the familiar, exhausted recognition settle over me. The same pattern I'd watched play out for over a decade. Terrence in a rough spot, my father solving it by giving away something that had never fully belonged to him in the first place. How far behind? I asked. A few months, he said, and then quieter. There's some other stuff too. Some money I owe some people. It's not a big deal. It's just this would really help. I didn't push further that day, but the shape of what was actually happening was becoming clearer with every conversation. My father, once again, solving Terrence's crisis by handing over something of real, substantial value, without once considering whether that value belonged to him to give away, and without once asking what I might need or want in the process. 9 days after that first phone call, I drove back to my hometown, the folder from Priscilla's office sitting on the passenger seat the entire drive, 4.5 hours of quiet, deliberate preparation for a conversation I'd been rehearsing since the moment I understood exactly what I was holding. I called my father the morning I arrived and told him I wanted to come by the house to talk things through properly. He sounded pleased, genuinely pleased, clearly interpreting my calm tone as acceptance rather than the careful patience it actually was. Terrence and his family will be there too, he said. Figured we could all sit down together, make sure everyone's on the same page. I arrived at 6 that evening. Terrence's car sat in the driveway alongside my father's, and through the front window, I could see more people gathered in the living room than I had expected. My aunt Denise, my father's younger sister, and my cousin Malcolm, along with Terrence's girlfriend, Priya, holding their toddler on her hip. My stomach tightened. This wasn't a conversation. This was an audience, assembled specifically to make disagreement feel socially costly. I almost turned around. Then I thought about my mother, sitting up in that same house 11 years earlier, telling me quietly that this place should be mine, that she'd already handled it, and I squared my shoulders and walked through the door I'd walked through 1,000 times as a child. "Sit down," my father said, gesturing to a single chair positioned facing the rest of the room. Arranged, I realized immediately, almost like a jury box. "I'll stand," I said. My Aunt Denise made a small, disapproving sound. "Always so particular," she murmured. "Just like your mother could be." "We're here because there's clearly been some confusion about the house," my father began, settling into his armchair with the comfortable authority of a man who believed the outcome of this conversation was already decided. "I want us to work through it as a family before anything gets more complicated than it needs to be." "There's no confusion," I said. "I understand exactly what's happening." "Then you understand your brother needs this," my father said. "He's got a family to think about now. Priya, the baby. He needs stability, and this house gives him that." And what was I supposed to get? I asked the same question I'd asked over the phone, though my voice was steadier now than it had been that day. "You've always managed fine on your own," my father said, echoing himself almost exactly. "You don't need help the way Terrence does." "That's not an answer," I said. "That's an excuse you've been using my entire life to justify giving him everything and expecting me to need nothing." Terrence shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "Renee, come on. This isn't about old stuff. It's about right now." "It's exactly about old stuff," I said, "because this is the same pattern it's always been. You get into trouble. Dad solves it by handing you something. Nobody asks what that costs anyone else." "That's unfair," my Aunt Denise said. "Terrence has had a hard road." "Terrence has had a road paved entirely by other people's sacrifices," I said, my voice sharper now than I'd intended, though I didn't try to soften it. "Including Mom's, though none of you seem to remember that part." The room went quiet for a moment. My father's face hardened. "Don't bring your mother into this." "She's already in this," I said. "She's been in this the entire time. You just didn't know it until right now." I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, the same weight and shape I'd been carrying through 4.5 hours of highway that afternoon, and set it down on the coffee table between us. "What's that?" my father asked, though something in his voice had already started to shift, some instinct recognizing that the ground beneath this conversation was about to move. 11 years ago," I said. "Mom went to an attorney named Priscilla, who, 6 months before she died, and established an irrevocable trust holding sole title to this house. She named me the sole beneficiary. The trust was legally recorded at the county recorder's office. It activated automatically 4 months ago on my 35th birthday. The silence that followed had real weight to it. "That's not possible," my father said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier certainty. "I would have known. I've lived in this house for 11 years. "You've lived here under what's called a life estate," I said, "a right to occupy the property during your lifetime, which Mom set up so you'd never lose your housing while you grieved and adjusted. But a life estate doesn't include the right to sell the property. It never did, which means whatever paperwork you've drawn up with Terrence, whatever draft sale sits with his attorney right now, is legally void the moment anyone tries to file it." Terrence's face had gone pale. "Dad, is this true?" "It's a lie," my father said, though he was staring at the folder like it might bite him. "Your mother would have told me something like that." "She specifically chose not to," I said, "because she knew exactly how you'd react. She knew you'd try to give this house to Terrence the moment you felt entitled to, and she made sure that by the time you tried, it would already be too late for that decision to matter. "You've been planning this," my father said, his voice rising now, something cornered and furious replacing the earlier confidence. "Sitting on this information, letting us believe." "I found out 9 days ago," I said, cutting him off, my voice steady even as my hands trembled slightly at my sides. "The same week you called to tell me you'd already sold my mother's house to my brother for $1, without asking me a single question about how that might feel." Priya, still holding the baby, had gone very quiet, watching the room with the careful, assessing expression of someone recalculating an entire situation in real time. "I need this," Terrence said suddenly, his voice cracking. "Renee, please. You don't understand how bad things are right now." "Then tell me," I said, turning to him directly. "Actually tell me, instead of letting Dad hand you a house he never had the right to give." Terrence's hands were shaking. "I owe some people money," he said finally, quietly. "More than rent. I got into some stuff, some betting apps. Some guys who aren't patient about getting paid back. The house, if I could sell even part of it, or use it as collateral." "Gambling," I said, and something in my chest went cold and still. The same word my mother had apparently understood about him for years without ever once saying it directly to me. My father's face had drained of color. "Is that true?" "You didn't know," I said quietly, looking at my father now, watching the specific horror of a man realizing he'd nearly handed a decade of his late wife's careful protection directly into the hands of the exact crisis she'd built this entire trust to prevent. Priscilla had warned me, during our final meeting before I drove out here, that my mother's trust documentation included something else. A personal letter she'd asked to be shared only if the situation ever escalated this far. I pulled it from the folder now, my mother's familiar handwriting covering both sides of the page. "She wrote this the same week she set up the trust," I said, and began to read it aloud, my voice unsteady in places, but steady enough to carry through the quiet room. My mother's letter explained, plainly and without cruelty, that she loved Terrence completely, that she understood the specific weight of his struggles better than anyone else in the family had ever let themselves see clearly, and that she had watched for years my father solve every one of Terrence's crises by handing over money or property, never once addressing whatever was actually driving the crisis underneath. She wrote that she believed with real conviction that continuing that pattern after she was gone would only deepen whatever Terrence was struggling with, not fix it. She wrote that she trusted me to hold this house not because she loved me more, but because she knew, with certainty, that I would never let it be quietly given away to solve a problem that giving it away had never actually solved before. And she wrote one more thing, near the end, that made my father sit down heavily in his armchair as I read it aloud. "If Terrence is ever in real crisis when this letter is read," she'd written, "please make sure he gets actual help, not another rescue that only delays the reckoning. The trust includes a separate provision for exactly this. Renee will know what to do with it." Priscilla had explained that provision to me the day before. A modest secondary fund, considerably smaller than the value of the house itself, set aside specifically to cover the cost of a certified treatment program, released only if Terrence enrolled and maintained verified sobriety and financial counseling for a full year. "There's help available," I told Terrence now, my voice softening slightly for the first time all evening. "Real help. Not the house, not another rescue, but something that might actually address what's happening instead of just delaying it." Terrence put his head in his hands and, for the first time and longer than I could remember, didn't argue. My father sat very still in his armchair, staring at the folder on the coffee table like it contained an entirely different version of his wife than the one he thought he'd known for 40 years. "She never told me," he said quietly, almost to himself. 11 years, and she never told me." "Maybe," I said, "because she knew exactly what you'd do with the house if you thought it was fully yours to give away. And she was right. You proved her right 9 days ago." Nobody in the room had anything to say to that. I didn't stay much longer that evening. I left the folder's contents with Priscilla's contact information copied for both my father and Terrence, along with the details of the treatment program provision, and told them clearly that the formal legal process to activate the trust and void the pending sale paperwork would move forward regardless of how anyone in that room felt about it, because it had never actually been a decision that belonged to any of us to make. My mother had already made it, 11 years earlier, with more clarity and foresight than any of us had given her credit for. The weeks that followed were procedural rather than dramatic. Priscilla filed the formal documentation confirming trust ownership, and the draft sale agreement Terrence's attorney had prepared was withdrawn entirely once it became clear the underlying transfer was legally impossible. My father, to his credit, didn't contest the trust once he understood exactly how thoroughly and deliberately my mother had structured it. Whatever anger he carried settled slowly into something quieter and more complicated, a man reckoning, late and imperfectly, with exactly how much he'd failed to see clearly for over a decade. Terrence entered a certified treatment program 6 weeks after that evening, funded by the provision my mother had set aside specifically for this exact possibility. I don't know yet how his story ends. Recovery isn't a single decision made once in a family meeting. It's a long, uncertain process, and I've learned to hold my hope for him carefully, without letting it become another version of the rescue that never actually helped him before. I kept the Maple Street house, though I didn't move back into it. I allowed my father to continue living there under a formal, clearly documented arrangement this time, one with real boundaries neither of us could quietly ignore or reinterpret later. We speak occasionally now, careful and a little formal, rebuilding something smaller and more honest than what we had before, because some things, once you see them clearly, don't simply go back to how they used to look. I visit the garden my mother planted along the back fence every few months, the same tomatoes and marigolds she used to tend every summer of my childhood. Standing there on a quiet afternoon a few months after everything settled, I finally opened the last letter Priscilla had included in that folder, one my mother had written for exactly this moment. "Baby girl," it read, "if you're reading this standing in my garden, it means you did the hard thing. It means you protected what mattered without becoming someone who forgets how to be gentle. That was always my greatest hope for you. Not that you'd win, but that you'd stay yourself while doing it." I folded the letter against my chest and looked up at the sky, the same particular gold light my mother used to love in that garden at exactly this hour. "I'm still myself, Mom," I whispered. "Exactly like you hoped." If this story touched you, if you've ever had to stand your ground against a family that expected you to need nothing while giving everything to someone else, drop a comment below. Share your story. You're not alone. And don't forget to subscribe for more real, honest stories about the families we come from and the boundaries we finally learn to hold.